Hey, what's up, nerds? PaulMConti here. I just wanted to do a quick video, inspired by a conversation I had with one of the guys in my local group about MATHHAMMER in general and the usefulness of MATHHAMMER, what you use it for, and what the limitations of it are. And I know I talk a lot about math on my channel, and I thought I would take some time out for a second and really kind of carve out what the purpose of doing all of that math is and where it fits in, what its place is in Age of Sigmar, in my opinion, what other factors there are, and really how to use it, when to use it, why to use it, right? So the key thing that I really use MATHHAMMER for is assessment and analysis of a unit on paper. To figure out what it does, it sets my expectations in a quantitative way. It gives me math that says X will do Y, and figuring out relative value of things that are similar but different. It gives you a general idea for list building, and sometimes a more specific idea for list building of what direction to go in. What's the relative power level of my list going to be like? What does this do? Are these abilities from this battalion perhaps worth their points, which is kind of a subjective judgment. That's all what I really use MATHHAMMER for. When I'm at the table playing a game of Warhammer, you will not see me doing math. You will not see me bringing a calculator out. You will not see me caring about the MATHHAMMER. And here's why. You do all the math before you build the list and while you're building the list. And that's the purpose. So that when you get to the table, you know what your units do. And when you're at that point, the math of what happens is not something you need to think about. You can concentrate on what's in front of you at that moment. You concentrate on the gameplay instead of figuring out the math. Can I do enough wounds with this? Well, can I figure out how much damage can this thing take? How long will I be able to withstand something on this objective? You kind of have that figured out already. You know, by doing all the math, and some people have this kind of intuitively, they can kind of feel by looking at the stats what a unit's going to do on the battlefield. And you use MATHHAMMER to have a more concrete, quantitative look at what a unit is going to do, so that when you're actually playing the game, you don't have to think about it. That's the key, is that it's taking the thinking about math and putting that before the game, not during the game. That way it saves you time, it saves you energy, it saves you stress. And I think that's really important. It lets you, when you're actually at the table, just kick back and enjoy yourself, because you're there to game. You're there to have a good time. You do the math first. You do that in the background. That's part of the list building process. And people that love to min-max their lists, that's a great place for them to thrive and analyze lists and figure out all the math. That's something that I enjoy doing. Although I find with certain armies, I do it more so than others. There's another very important component that we really need to talk about here too, is that math isn't the only thing that you really need to think about when you are building your list and playing your list. There's a lot of psychological factors involved. There's tactics involved, knowing what your units do, what their different roles are. A great example from the conversation that I had, with my friend at the club was, what do you do with Scarbrand? Is Scarbrand worth his points? And the point that I really made was he is very, very strong. He's swingy, which we can tell from the math. But here's what he does on the battlefield, right? He is big and scary. He has a crazy psychological factor. So you advance him up the middle of the battlefield, and your opponent's going to focus on him. Because if they don't focus on him, they could potentially be really, really fucked. And that allows you in a Khorne army to get all of your other stuff into position that's not as fast. That gets you into position, get into combats. It baits your opponent forward to address that threat. And it keeps your opponent away from addressing your other threats that realistically, like, that's maybe what your list is really doing, is all of that other stuff. And Scarbrand is a big 400-point distraction, but if he does that 400-point distraction really well, then he does his job and he's earned his points and he doesn't need to kill anything. So sometimes the MATHHAMMER doesn't matter that much. Playing a Nurgle list, for example, like a Great Unclean One is another great example of, like, it's a big point sink. Is it really worth 340 points for a Great Unclean One? Now, it's hard to math out depending on the build. If you're going strictly on an offensive build, it's a little bit more quantitative. You can figure out how much it's actually worth, at least by comparison to some other units. There's a big psychological factor there. He's a big monster that casts 2 spells a turn, that has a lot of wounds, that can heal, and is very resilient. He's potentially a guy that's buffing your other troops. He's kind of a must answer for your opponent. So what does that do? It's a big distraction. It's a big psychological factor that gets played in. So you have to figure out those sort of soft things, the soft scores in your list that you can't just straight MATHHAMMER out. MATHHAMMER's not everything. It's one of your tools in your toolbox for figuring out what's good and bad in your army, which things are going to be superior to other things when you're making selections to build a list. But it's not the be-all, end-all. It's a tool in the toolbox. I think it's an important tool in the toolbox. But key takeaways, again, MATHHAMMER's not everything. You do the math ahead of time so that you don't have to do the math during the game, so that you already know what your expectations are when you roll up to the table, and you can just hang out and have a good time and roll some dice. And you can have a relatively close idea of how your units are going to perform. You know what they're going to do. And that's the point of MATHHAMMER, to just be able to keep the math at home and have fun at the table. All right, that's it for now, kids. I will see you all later. It's been fun. Have a good one.